Hello and welcome to the Agent Survival Guide podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Ruppel, and it is Friday, June 7th. This week, we are putting a laser focus on one topic, and that topic is the insurance licensing exam, a brand new topic for us here on the podcast. What I would like to do today is share a couple of things I learned as I was going through this process. So first things first, I guess I should mention which insurance license exam I'm talking about, since there are more than a couple of options to choose from. It would be the life, health, and accident version in the state of Pennsylvania. And since we've never given background details on the licensing exam experience for agents, there are a few more things I want to mention before I get into our official list. Insurance licensing requirements vary from state to state, so you will want to read up on that information prior to getting started. There are a couple of ways to do that. You can either go directly to your state's Department of Insurance website, or you can use the National Association of Insurance Commissioners website. They actually link out to each state's Department of Insurance, and we will be linking to that NAIC resource in the notes. In Pennsylvania, where this podcast and Ritter Insurance Marketing are headquartered, the Life, Health, and Accident license requires educational training to be completed prior to taking the exam. And then licensed agents must complete a certain amount of continuing education credits to maintain their license. CE credit courses are offered by a variety of companies at a few different price points, depending on what the courses include. Pre-licensing courses usually function as self-led study guides for the actual licensing exam. Most courses should include outlines, practice quizzes, and tests. Higher-priced courses might include extras like practical application, training videos, and instructor support, just to name a few. So, with that all being said, let's get into number one on the list: research and planning. Before you sign up for anything, I recommend, as I mentioned earlier, researching the requirements in your state as well as the prep course options available to you. I had a conversation with our learning team here at Ritter to talk through the different license options as well as the pre-licensing study courses. Now, a lot of that information exists in our night school video training series. We will be linking to that in the notes. And certainly, if you have questions, we invite you to reach out because we would love to help answer some of those for you. We cannot give you answers to the test, but I think sometimes it just helps talking to someone who's been through it before. In addition to research, I also mentioned planning. If you're taking a pre-certification course, I'll use the Pennsylvania example of 24 credit hours. It will take longer than just 24 hours to complete that training. 24 hours is the amount of training you will be working through, but that doesn't account for taking notes or reviewing content. If I had to estimate the time I spent completing coursework and studying, it would probably come out closer to 48 hours, including the time I spent studying, taking practice tests, and reviewing that material. I happen to take copious amounts of notes, and I did create a document just for definitions. So your mileage may vary depending on your learning style. For me, I learn well by reading, listening to, or watching content, and then taking notes while I'm doing that, going back to paraphrase those notes or concepts, writing them all out by hand. It's a lengthy process. And regardless of what kind of content I'm interacting with, if it uses examples, a simulation, or demonstration, some way that I can apply it back to some form of knowledge that I'm already familiar with, it's more likely that that information will stick. And I'm sure for those of you listening, You probably also know how you learn best as well. I would suggest keeping that in mind as you're going through the initial planning phase. Make sure you allocate the proper amount of time to learn the content in the style you prefer, the one that will help you retain the most information. And think about timeframes too. Make sure that you don't have too many interruptions to your planned schedule. This is not content that you want to cram for and then take the test. It's a lot of information, and the more time you give yourself to absorb that information, the better you're going to do on your exam. Now, for those of you who listened last week, our poll of the week asked the question about learning styles with the knowledge that I was going to talk about this topic this week. So thank you for those of you who took the time to respond. There were 4 learning styles to choose from in that poll. And if you've previously heard of the VARK method of learning, that is where those methods in the poll came from. Slightly different than what I learned when I was in school. VARK stands for visual, auditory, reading and writing, and kinesthetic learning styles. Now, let's talk about results because surprisingly to me, considering that this is a podcast, auditory learning came in last place. In a tie for second place, visual learning and the read and write method of learning. And then coming in first place, kinesthetic learning, which is described as, quote, perceptual preference related to the use of experience and practice, simulated or real, end quote. And again, basically examples, scenarios, demos, case studies, things that are grounded in reality, quote, either through concrete personal experiences, examples, practice, or simulation, end quote. Very interesting answers. And again, thank you to those who participated in our poll. We really appreciate you. Let's move on to number 2 on the list. It's okay if you hit a wall in your studying. I think I was about halfway through the life insurance section when I started thinking, why am I doing this? You might get to a point where you feel a little bit overwhelmed by studying. If you get to that point, take a break. That's why we don't suggest going through the pre-certification course in a time frame as short as a week or even a weekend. Give yourself time to work through the material at a sustainable pace and really absorb the information. Also, don't lose sight of why you want to get your license in the first place. Whether it's a completely new career path or a new line of business for your portfolio, keep that motivation top of mind. Number 3, piggybacking on the idea of hitting a wall. The good thing about that is there's usually a way to think around it and keep going. Find your groove. Find what works for you. After I hit my wall, I switched up the way I was taking notes. I started out taking notes as I was reading through the material. And after I hit the wall, I switched to reading through the content first, sometimes even reading it aloud, and then taking any necessary notes after I had read through each concept. Just that small little switch helped me to remember a lot more of what I was reading as my attention was solely focused on that. Number 4, let's talk flashcards, because as much as I normally like flashcards, the ones included in my coursework were not always helpful. So here's the thing. The flashcards were an included option that in my research and planning phase, I thought seemed like a good thing to be included. If I had to rate them, I would put them at about half effective, half not. And here's why. For the flashcards that presented a single term with a single definition, those were great. They worked very well. But there were definitions that could have been further broken down. Sometimes definitions were lumped together as versus definitions, where it was important to know the difference between the two terms. Sometimes they required more than one term, like an insurable risk or the elements of a contract. For me, I think these cards would have been much more beneficial if they were laid out as one term with one definition. Now, I know this is small potatoes, as we like to say here at Ritter, but for me, it is significant potatoes. Now, I'm very well aware I could have created my own set of flashcards with definitions broken out in the manner I just described, but that would have taken a lot of time to create from scratch. So for an included resource that I thought I would use a lot, I didn't find it as helpful as I initially thought, and I didn't use it that often. But again, your mileage may vary. Moving on to number 5, what helped me the most? And that was taking practice tests, a lot of them. My course included quizzes as I went through each lesson, and then concluded with a practice exam. Prior to taking that practice exam, I was able to take simulated practice exams, which I called practice exams. Thankfully, there were no limits to the amount of these simulated practice exams. I was able to create and take as many as I liked. In the weekend leading up to my exam, that was all I did. I continually took those practice exams. And full disclosure, I failed the first one. But after that happened, here's what I did next. I reviewed my incorrect answers and wrote them all out by hand in a notebook. I also wrote down a list of definitions to review for some of the concepts that I was struggling with. Some of those definitions were surrender charge, the right to examine provisions, riders in general, the elimination period, and so on. After I reviewed the incorrect answers, I took a little break. Then I came back and took another practice exam. Each time I went through this test, review, correct, and write out definitions process, my score got a little bit higher. When I got to the point that I felt confident in my knowledge, I was able to take the actual practice exam to finish out my pre-certification course and pass that on the first try. I do wish that I had started taking the practice exams a little bit sooner because that really helped to ingrain some of the more confusing concepts like tax laws and the way they differ depending on product and if it's money going into an account or being paid out to a beneficiary and when. I cannot recommend taking those practice exams enough. And one final, bonus thought for the day. Rupel recommends. The questions are multiple choice. Some of them are worded in ways to absolutely trip you up. That is the way multiple choice exams work. So make sure you're taking the time to read the question and every answer at least twice. There were quite a few double negatives that tripped me up. We will be linking to a document with strategies to keep in mind while you're taking a multiple choice exam. There are some great tips on there to keep tucked into the back of your mind, of course, in addition to a good amount of studying and really knowing the content. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, if you have questions about licensing, we would love to hear from you. Send us an email at asgpodcast@ritterim.com or call and leave a voicemail for us at 1-717-562-7211. If you like this episode, we would love it if you'd follow along with our show. We've got a sizable archive of content if you have just discovered the show. And if you've been listening for a while and know anyone who is brand new to the industry, just starting out on their insurance journey, We would love it if you would share this episode with them. Bottom line, we want to help you survive the industry, and the licensing exam is where it all starts. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. I hope you have a great weekend. Stay healthy and stay safe out there, and we will see you next week. The Agent Survival Guide podcast is a production of Ritter Insurance Marketing, an integrity company. This episode was written and produced by me, Sarah Ruppel. Script editing and fact check by Tina Lamoureux. Podcast design by Urban Rivera. Artwork by Vivian Zhao. Follow along with us wherever you like to listen.